Hello, my name is Austin Habish, the founder of Think Catholic, and you're listening to the Summa podcast, where we study St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae in a way simple and insightful for anyone to understand. The Summa podcast is brought to you by Think Catholic. Taking 2 questions of the Summa a day, we'll seek to summarize St. Thomas's responses, discovering the brilliance of Aquinas and his Catholic faith. This is day 100, believe it or not. So let's get started. We're covering today questions 78 and 79 of the Prima Secundae, that is, of that cause of sin which is malice, and of the external causes of sin. The translation that I always use in these podcasts is the one generously provided to me by Ave Maria Press, the 5-volume set translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican province, which you can now get at a discounted price from Ave Maria Press's site by typing in the code Summa 10. And so here we go. Article 1, whether anyone sins through certain malice. And this is a profound article. Beginning with St. Thomas, he writes, ignorance sometimes excludes the simple knowledge that a particular action is evil, and then man is said to sin through ignorance. Sometimes it excludes the knowledge that a particular action is evil at this particular moment, as when happens through passion. And from here, he'll turn to consider what malice is, but instead of quoting him, it's probably easier just to explain malice in different words. Sin through malice is a uniquely deliberate sin, choosing some particular evil act known as evil. Not when, as St. Thomas already mentioned, one didn't know some particular action to be evil, although they culpably should have known that, or because they knew the action was evil, but due to passion they judged it to be okay in this particular circumstance. Sin via malice is choosing an evil as evil, and the only reason one would do that is for the sake of possessing some other good. For example, the murderer murdering someone, an act he knows to be evil, but for the sake of the good of possessing that man's wealth. Sins of malice are sins which, in a phrase, take the end to justify the means. Knowing that adultery is evil, as another example, but saying to oneself, well, adultery is better than being alone. This is a sin of malice. Choosing an evil from the spiritual, eternal perspective for the sake of some fleeting, apparent, temporal good. St. Thomas concludes, evil is merely the privation of some good, and so a man wishes knowingly a spiritual evil, which is evil simply, whereby he is deprived of a spiritual good in order to possess a temporal good, wherefore he is said to sin through certain malice or on purpose, because he chooses evil knowingly. Article 2, whether everyone that sins through habit sins through certain malice. Habits, as we have described in previous episodes, are stable dispositions or qualities in our faculties, which we don't necessarily have to utilize. The man with the habit of acting unjustly may act, in some instance, justly for some reason or another. On the other hand, a man with the virtue of charity may sin against charity. The question of this article is whether those who sin via a stable disposition, so the serial killer taking another innocent life through his habit of doing so, does that sin through vice entail necessarily a kind of malice? Here St. Thomas says, whenever one uses the vicious habit, he must needs sin through certain malice. And this is because habits change us. Vicious habits make vicious acts connatural to us, or similar to us, proportionate to us, in such a way as to be lovable in our own eyes. And by acting according to these vices, we necessarily act against spiritual good, the spiritual good opposed to them. Therefore, in willing some spiritual evil for the sake of obtaining whatever is related to some particular vice, we can be said to sin through a certain malice. Article 3, whether one who sins through certain malice sins through habit. Is it possible to sin maliciously without having the inordinate, stable disposition, aka vice, affecting one's faculties. And it is possible. A man may have no custom or habit of sexual sin, for example, and still commit it. How could this happen? It might have happened through ignorance, simply speaking, not having a well-formed conscience, which one is in this case likely culpable for. The sin might have occurred through passion, which created a kind of particular ignorance, or made what would generally seem sinful actually seem suitable or desirable in some particular circumstance. Or even without the habit of this sin, one may either have simply willed it as a known spiritual evil for the sake of some mutable temporal good, pleasure in this case. One may have previously foregone the fear of God or hope of eternal life, which would have otherwise protected them from this sin, or one may have sinned through the habit or custom of this sin. So sins of malice can definitely come through habit, but also they can come without habit, which is our response to this article. Article 4, whether it is more grievous to sin through certain malice than through passion. It is more grievous to choose a spiritual evil for the sake of some mutable good, which is malice, than to momentarily miss the mark in pursuing some intended good due to the influence of passion. Think of the difference between the man who kills his neighbor for the sake of stealing from him and the man who kills his neighbor because he was struck by a fit of rage. The first is more diabolical, more deliberate, more indicative of habitual evil in the man, and more serious for having an intended end, which is off, in this case, theft or money as one's ultimate end or goal. For all these reasons, sin through malice is more grievous than sins through passion. In a word from St. Thomas, he that sins through passion is induced through the passion to choose what he would not choose were it not for the passion. On the other hand, he that sins through certain malice chooses evil of his own accord in the way already explained, so that his choosing, of which he has full control, is the principle of his sin. And with that, we move to question 79 of the external causes of sin, Article 1, whether God is a cause of sin. Now, this seems like an easy no, but we have to remember, as we mentioned in episodes 12 and 13, that all things happen according to God's providence, and sin obviously exists in the world. So we need to be able to give an adequate account of both God's omnibenevolence, his innocence, his providence, as well as the real existence of sin in the world. God cannot be the direct or indirect cause of sin. He cannot be the direct cause of sin because he inclines nothing to evil, but inclines all things towards their respective particular goods and then ultimately to himself. He also cannot be the cause of sin indirectly by not giving some assistance to those who have justly foregone the right to that assistance through their own evil, who might have been prevented from some particular sin by the grace of God. This is the short answer to this article, which receives more treatment in the subsequent articles. Article 2, whether the act of sin is from God. And this is a particularly nuanced article, so it's probably best to give St. Thomas's words and then explain them. St. Thomas writes, "Sin denotes a being and an action with a defect, and this defect is from the created cause, the free will, as falling away from the order of the first agent, which is God. Consequently, this defect is not reduced to God as its cause, but to the free will, even as the defect of limping is reduced to a crooked leg as its cause, but not to the moving power, which nevertheless causes whatever there is of movement in the limping. Accordingly, God is the cause of the act of sin, and yet he is not the cause of sin, because he does not cause the act to have a defect. So anything that exists and changes must trace its way back to God as its ultimate cause. That was Aquinas' first, second, and third ways, or proofs for God, as we described in episode 2 of this podcast. But the defect or lack, which causes an act To be evil, the wrong ordering of it, the disorder of it, must come from the creature and from their will specifically. So even though God must be the cause of an evil act, since he must be the ultimate cause of all acts, anywhere and always, the proximate reason or cause for the deficiency in that act must be attributed to us or to one's voluntariness. Giving the final word to St. Thomas here, he writes, "Man is the cause of the sin, while God is the cause of the act, in such a way that nowise is he the cause of the defect accompanying the act, so that he is not the cause of the sin." Article 3, whether God is the cause of spiritual blindness and hardness of heart. St. Thomas responds to this article very briefly in writing, "I answer that spiritual blindness and hardness of heart imply two things. One is the movement of the human mind in cleaving to evil and turning away from the divine light. And as regards this, God is not the cause of spiritual blindness and hardness of heart, just as he is not the cause of sin. The other thing is the withdrawal of grace, the result of which is that the mind is not enlightened by God to see aright in man's heart, is not softened to live aright. And as regards this, God is the cause of spiritual blindness and hardness of heart." So God is the cause of the withdrawal of grace, but for him to do so, it must of course be just. And in the just withdrawal of grace, God can be said to be the cause of spiritual blindness and hardness of heart. Article 4, our last article, whether blindness and hardness of heart are directed to the salvation of those who are blinded and hardened. And this is not necessarily the case. We know by revelation that hell is real, that hell is not empty. And so it must be the case that some were blinded and hardened of heart that did not ultimately come to salvation. But for some, surely it does help, for those who then acknowledge their sin and turn humbly to God to be healed by him. As St. Thomas puts it, every evil that God does or permits to be done is directed to some good. Yet not always to the good of those in whom the evil is, but sometimes to the good of others or of the whole universe. Thus he directs the sin of tyrants to the good of the martyrs and the punishment of the lost to the glory of his justice. And that is all for another episode. We have just finished covering questions 78 and 79 of the Prima Secundae, that is, of that cause of sin which is malice, and of the external causes of sin. My name is Austin Habish with Think Catholic, and I cannot wait to see you tomorrow.